The law of supply says there is a positive relationship between the price and the quantity of a good supplied over a particular time. Remember the law of demand? Price goes up, quantity demanded goes down, and vice versa. The law of demand has a negative relationship because the variables move in opposite directions. But the law of supply has a positive relationship because the variables move in the same direction. When price goes up, quantity supplied goes up. When price goes down, quantity supplied goes down. And of course, just like the law of demand, we need to include ceteris paribus for this to be true. So again, even if I don't say it, ceteris paribus is being assumed throughout this lesson. The law of supply is pretty easy to understand. Of course, business owners want to make as much money as possible. So as the price goes up, they'll want to supply more products, right? That's the law of supply at work. But have you ever wondered why it's an upward sloping line? I mean, the more products a firm sells, the more money and revenue they make, right? So why doesn't the firm just produce as much as they can at the same price, which would be a horizontal line? To understand the law of supply and why a business would require a higher price in order to make more units, therefore making the supply curve an upward sloping line, we need to first understand a couple of other things. Now, this next section is going to talk about the underlying assumptions of the law of supply, which is HL content. I usually put the HL content at the end of the video, but to really understand the law of supply, you need to learn about marginal costs and marginal returns. So if you're an SL student, even though you won't be tested on this, you might want to pay attention because this stuff will be useful for you too. So let's get back to it. Just like the law of demand had some underlying assumptions, so too does the law of supply. It's called the law of diminishing marginal returns, and it basically tells us that as we produce more, we will become less and less efficient. Let's see it in action with an example, and we'll track the data with this chart. As you can see, we have two columns, input and output. In economic terms, inputs are the factors of production: land, labor, capital, entrepreneurship. To put it more simply, inputs are anything that helps you make your product. And then output is what you make, your product. Okay, so imagine you start a small pizza restaurant. Now, of course, whenever you run a business, you're going to have a ton of different inputs. But to make things easier to understand for this example, let's just simplify things and say you only have one input: cooks. In the beginning, you don't have any cooks, so, of course, you don't have any pizzas. So your input and output are both zero for now. So you post an ad online looking for an experienced pizza maker that you will pay $100 per day. Eventually you find one, so now you can begin to make pizzas. The cook can make 5 pizzas per day. Not a lot, but you don't have many customers yet since you're new, so no worries. Now let's introduce another column, marginal product. Remember, margin means additional or extra. So the marginal product is how many extra units you produced with each additional unit of input. So, in other words, marginal product will measure the effect of adding more inputs and tell us how efficiently we are producing. Since the new cook produces 5 more pizzas than what you had before when you didn't have a cook, we can say that our marginal product is 5. And for the first row, remember, marginal product measures the additional output of additional input. Because we didn't have any inputs in the beginning, we can't measure the marginal product for the first row. Okay, back to your pizza restaurant. Things were slow in the beginning, but soon word starts to spread about how good your pizzas are, and business picks up, so you need more help. You hire another cook. Now, with 2 cooks working together, they can divide the labor so that they both do the tasks that they are best at. This way, things are more efficient, and they can produce 15 pizzas per day. Great! Now your marginal product has increased to 10. So you think to yourself, well, if 2 workers are better than 1, then 3 must be better than 2. So you hire a third cook.
With the third cook, your restaurant is now able to produce 20 pizzas per day. So while the third cook did help increase the total output, it only was a difference of 5. As you can see, our marginal product has now decreased. So you decide to hire another cook to try to push the numbers up again. After all, your pizzas are becoming famous and you need to keep up with the demand. So you hire a fourth cook and now you produce 22 pizzas a day. So, in other words, that fourth cook only increased output by 2 units. What's going on? Why is our marginal product decreasing? Well, one reason is that you only have one pizza oven, and you can only cook so many pizzas at one time. So, while yes, more cooks means more pizzas, as you can see by the increasing total output, unless you buy another pizza oven, each worker is not going to be as productive as they could be. That's the law of diminishing marginal returns. At first, your inputs are going to work more and more efficiently, and your marginal product will increase. But eventually, you'll hit a point where things will start to become inefficient and your marginal product will decrease.
But let's say you, as the business owner, never studied IB economics, and you have no idea about the law of diminishing marginal returns. So, you go ahead and hire a fifth and sixth worker, hoping to get your productivity back up. Since you've already hit your production limitation from the pizza oven, the fifth worker adds no additional output. So, our marginal product has now dropped to 0. With the sixth worker, now there are so many cooks in the kitchen that there's barely any room to move around. This slows everything down, and now your total output actually decreases to 18. Now we have a negative marginal product. As you can see, your marginal product started out increasing in the beginning with each additional cook, but eventually reached a point where it started to decrease. This is what we call the law of diminishing returns. And don't get confused, the point of diminishing returns is not when it goes negative, it's when the marginal product starts to decrease, which is after we hired the third worker. Okay, let's take a look at the textbook definition, because it's complicated. The law of diminishing marginal returns states that, in the short run, as more and more of a variable input is added to fixed inputs, the marginal product of the variable input initially increases, but there comes a point where it begins to decrease. So you're probably wondering, what the heck does that mean? Let's break it down. First, let's talk about what fixed and variable means. Just like in everyday English, when we say something is fixed, that means it doesn't move or change, at least not easily. As a student, you probably have a fixed schedule, meaning your schedule is the same every week and doesn't change. In economic terms, it is essentially the same. So, when we say fixed inputs, we mean inputs that don't change easily or often. What are some examples of fixed inputs? Buildings, factories, expensive machines, things like that. In the pizza restaurant, obviously, it would help a lot if you could build a bigger kitchen, right? But that wouldn't be easy, cheap, or quick. So we could say that the kitchen, the space we used for production, was a fixed input. And then variable is just the opposite. Variable inputs can change easily and often. So, in our simplified example, the cooks were the variable input. When we needed more cooks, we hired them quickly and easily. And if we didn't need them, then we could fire them just as easily. In a more real-world example, other variable inputs would have been the ingredients used to make the pizza. For instance, cheese. If I needed more, I could go to the store and buy more cheese quickly and easily. That's variable inputs. Next, we need to talk about short run and long run. This is a concept that a lot of students get confused about because it has a different definition in economic terms than the way we use it in everyday English. It's confusing because it actually doesn't have anything to do with an amount of time. Let me explain. The short run is defined as a time period in which at least one input is fixed. So, in other words, there is something about your business that is not easily changed. For most businesses, this is usually the building or equipment, but it could be anything that is not easily changed. On the other hand, the long run is a time period when all inputs can be changed, which makes sense because nothing lasts forever, right? So, with enough time, everything will change eventually. So, the long run means there are no fixed inputs. Where a lot of students get confused here is that they try to apply a time frame to these terms. So, you might say, well, 10 years is a long time, so that must be the long run, right? Not necessarily. It all depends on the business. For example, let's say I own a hotel and I have a 30-year lease on the building. That means I won't be able to change buildings for at least 30 years. So, 10 years for me would still be the short run. Anything under 30 years would be the short run since my building will be a fixed input until my lease runs out. Compare this to another type of business. Let's say I make food deliveries using on my bicycles. Bicycles are pretty inexpensive and I don't need a license or insurance like you do with a car. Therefore, it would be pretty quick and easy to change a bicycle. You could probably change your bicycle every week if you wanted to. And so, your long run would be anything over 1 week. So, as you can see, long and short are both relative to the type of business that it is. So, instead of trying to attach an amount of time to these terms, you need to follow the definition. Short run is when there's at least one fixed input. Long run is when there are no longer any fixed inputs. Okay, so back to the definition, and let's use our pizza restaurant to understand it. So, our kitchen and the pizza oven were fixed inputs, so we can say that we were in the short run. And our variable input were the cooks we hired. So, the definition is basically saying that as our pizza restaurant hired more workers, at first we were able to make more additional pizzas, but eventually got to a point where each additional worker made less and less additional pizzas. Whew, okay, that was a lot, but hopefully you got it. That was the law of diminishing returns. Up next is increasing marginal cost. This one won't be quite as bad, so hang in there.
Okay, so in later videos, we're going to cover costs in much more detail. For now, so this video doesn't become 4 hours long, we're going to skip over most of the details about costs. All you really need to know for now is that marginal costs at first decrease, but then later increase as more units are produced. Let's talk about why that is. You can think of marginal costs as the inverse of marginal product. Let's look at the diagrams to see what I mean. Here's marginal product. So remember from our pizza restaurant, our marginal product in the beginning increased as we started hiring more cooks, but then reached a point of diminishing returns, and we saw our marginal product start to decrease. Okay, now let's consider costs. Now, of course, the cooks don't work for free, right? So as we hired more workers, our costs also increased. Even when our total number of pizzas produced decreased, when we hired the 6th cook, our costs still increased because we had to pay him. Now let's look at marginal costs, or the cost of producing an additional unit. So remember, the first cook only made 5 pizzas per day, but with 2 cooks, they could produce 15 pizzas. This means that our production got more efficient, and when things are more efficient, they become cheaper. So in other words, the cost per unit decrease. But then our pizza restaurant hit a point of diminishing marginal returns, where we become inefficient, which means more expensive, which means higher costs per unit. It became more and more expensive to make an additional pizza. So now you can see what I mean when I said that marginal costs is the inverse of marginal product. As your marginal product decreases, it gets more and more expensive to make additional products, so your marginal costs increase as the marginal product decreases.
Now that you understand the underlying assumptions of the law of supply, let's use another example to show why the supply curve is upward sloping. Imagine I pay you to study economics. That would be amazing, right? I mean, I know you were going to study econ anyway, but now that I'm going to pay you, you're actually excited about it. So you get to it, you're watching Kevin Mean's business videos, you're reading the textbook, you're drawing diagrams, the whole thing. You start out great and you're learning a lot, but after 4 hours, you start to get tired and you decide to stop. And then, just as I promised, I give you a crisp $100 bill. Not bad, right? But then I say, you know, if you study for just 1 more hour, I'll give you another $100. Well, this is a pretty good deal, right? I mean, you got $100 for 4 hours before, but now you'll get another 100 for just 1 more hour. You're pretty tired, but that's a tough deal to pass up, so you agree. You study, but you're really sleepy, and it takes more and more effort to focus on economics. Eventually, the hour finishes, and then I offer you another $100 for an additional hour. But you say, no way. You just want to go home and sleep. But what if I increase the price? $200? $500? $1,000 just to sit there and study for 1 hour? Everyone has a different amount they would agree to. But the point is that the price would have to eventually increase in order for you to continue studying. And that's why we have an upward sloping supply curve. The longer you study, the harder it gets to focus, right? It was pretty easy to focus the first hour, but after 5 hours, it takes a lot more effort. And your effort is basically the marginal cost of studying. So the longer you study, the more money you'll want to study for an additional hour. It's the same for businesses. As production continues, it takes more effort and therefore more money to produce additional units. At first, it's easy, but eventually you hit the point of diminishing marginal returns. So, in order to incentivize the business to produce more, the price needs to increase. Just like in order to incentivize you to study more, I had to increase the amount of money I gave to you. And that's why we have an upward sloping supply curve. Just like with demand, we need to differentiate between individual and market supply. It's the same as demand, but instead of customers, now we're referring to the individual firms producing the product. And if you add all of those supply curves together for the same product, you'll get the market supply. We also need to differentiate between movement along the existing supply curve and shifts of the supply curve itself. And it's exactly the same as demand. When we have a change in price, then we will move to a new point on the existing supply curve, because we're talking about a new price causing a different quantity that the business is willing to supply. This is called a change in quantity supplied. When the quantity supplied changes, but the price stays the same, then this will shift the entire supply curve to the right or left, which is referred to as simply a change in supply. These are changes caused by factors other than the price, so we call them non-price determinants. Let's take a look at the non-price determinants that would shift the supply curve. Remember when we were talking about demand, we are considering things from the customer's point of view. But now with supply, we need to consider things from the firm's perspective. So, what are some factors, other than the price of the good, that would make a firm want to produce more or less of their product? The first factor we'll consider is a change in the cost of the factors of production. Let's say the costs have decreased. In other words, our production has become cheaper, so the firm is now willing to supply a higher quantity for the same price as before. We can show that on a diagram by shifting the supply curve to the right. And of course, if the factors of production become more expensive, then for any given price, the firm is now only willing to produce a lesser amount of the product, so this shifts the supply curve to the left. Another thing that has an effect on the cost of production is technology. As technology improves, so does efficiency. Because of this, we can produce things much easier and faster than ever before. And whenever you produce things easier and faster, that means you can produce things cheaper than before. In other words, this decreases costs. So again, as costs decrease, firms are able to supply a higher quantity for the same price, shifting the supply curve to the right. Much less likely, but still possible, is a decrease in technology. This would have the opposite effect and increase production costs, pushing the supply curve to the left. Even though firms pay taxes after the production is already finished, they still consider it to be a cost of production. Because of this, taxes have the same effect as changes in the cost of factors of production. So again, if the tax is increased, costs increase. So now the firm will now supply less for the same price, shifting the supply curve to the left. And if the tax decreases, costs decrease, making production cheaper, allowing the firm to supply more at the same price, shifting the supply curve to the right. Whereas a tax is money paid to the government, a subsidy is basically the opposite. It's when the government pays the firm per unit of goods produced. In later videos, we look at subsidies in more detail and learn why the government might want to do that. But for today's video, the important thing for you to understand is simply that a subsidy effectively makes the production process cheaper. Therefore, if subsidies are given, then the supply curve will shift to the right, since firms can now supply more at the same price. Or if subsidies are lessened or taken away completely, this will effectively make things more expensive. So the firm will want to supply less at the same price level, shifting our curve to the left. It's a little confusing why these are non-price determinants. Let me try to explain. Even though taxes and subsidies effectively change the price received by the seller or the cost of production, since taxes and subsidies are paid after the good is produced and sold, the market price at which the good is sold actually stays the same. So that's why these are still considered to be non-price determinants. Prices of related goods, in the cases of joint and competitive supply. The price of related goods is also considered a non-price determinant, since it deals with the price of other goods and not the price of the good itself. But just as we saw with demand, the price of related goods has a wider effect across more than just the one product. Joint supply goods are two different goods that are made during the same production process, so that the creation of one causes the creation of the other. A good example of this is beef and leather. Beef comes from the meat of a cow, and leather comes from the skin of a cow. So by producing more beef, you'll automatically also produce more leather at the same time. So an increase in the price of beef will increase the quantity supplied of beef. But that will be a new quantity at a new price, so this will be shown on a diagram as a movement along the supply curve for beef. But on a diagram for the supply of leather, assuming the price of leather hasn't also changed because beef producers increased their quantity supplied due to a higher price, and because leather is also produced when beef is produced, we will also see an increase in the supply of leather, but at the same price level, which will shift the entire supply curve to the right for leather. So let's say we have two joint supply goods, good A and good B. If the price of good A increases, then the supply of good B will increase due to the increase in the quantity supplied of good A as the firms chase the higher prices. And if the price of good A decreases, firms will reduce production of good A, and so then you won't get as much good B either, meaning a decrease in supply of good B. Another type of related goods are competitive supply goods. Don't get confused, we're not talking about two businesses competing against one another here. Instead, we're talking about resources. A fundamental concept in economics is that resources are scarce. So you need to make choices about what resources you use and how you use them. So when trying to decide and make this choice, there is competition between your options. Because remember, opportunity cost. If you choose option A, that means you don't choose option B. So it's like the resources are competing against one another to try to be the one you choose. For example, let's say you are a farmer, and on your land you can grow wheat or you can grow corn. These are your two choices. But imagine that the price of corn suddenly shoots up.
Well, now the decision becomes a lot easier, right? Obviously, you're going to choose to grow corn because you want to make more money. But think about what that does to the supply of the other choice. That's right, it's going to decrease. There will now be less supply of wheat because the price of corn increased and you decided to grow corn instead of wheat. So let's say we have two competitive supply goods, good X and good Y. A price increase in good X will result in a decrease in the supply of good Y. And because there's a change in the supply of good Y without the price of good Y changing, this is a non-price determinant. And also, if there's a decrease in the price of good X, we will see an increase in the supply of good Y.
As we learned in the previous video, future expectations can affect demand in the present. For example, if you know the price of a product is going to get more expensive in the future, if you can, you'll buy it now while it's still cheap and before it gets expensive. But what would you do if you were the seller, not the customer? The exact opposite. So if you think the price of your product is going to get more expensive in the future, instead of selling now, you'll wait until the price goes up, so you'll make more money. So even though you might continue producing, if you stop selling, this means that your goods are not available. So this decreases the supply currently available to the market. So, if firms expect an increase in prices in the future, they will decrease supply in the present. If firms expect a decrease in prices in the future, they will increase supply in the present. Number of firms. And an obvious one is simply the number of firms producing a good. An increase in the number of firms increases the supply, causing a rightward shift. And a decrease in the number of firms causes a decrease in supply, causing a leftward shift. And oh my God, I think we're finished. Well, that took almost forever. Hopefully you're still awake, and sorry, no, I'm not actually going to pay you to study economics. That was just an example. But hopefully you have a good understanding of supply now. Obviously, we're going to talk a lot more about supply as the course goes on, since almost everything in economics boils down to either supply or demand. But that's good enough for now. So make sure you're able to explain the law of supply and the relationship between price and quantity supplied, draw a supply curve, explain the relationship between individual supply and market supply, analyze the non-price determinants of supply as causes of supply curve shifts, and distinguish between movements along the supply curve and shifts of the supply curve. And for the HL students, you should be able to explain the assumptions that underlie the law of supply. As always, leave your questions in the comments for me. See ya!